For those of you that don't know, creepypastas are horror stories that are created for the internet. They can be made by anybody and have an urban legend sort of vibe to them. There are plenty of good creepypastas out there, but Sturgeon's law of course applies, and for every good creepypasta, there's probably 8 or 10 bad ones. Today's example will, of course, be one of the latter, Sonic.exe. Written by JC the Hyena, Sonic.exe became an internet phenomenon despite it being poorly written and insanely melodramatic. Some people like it, some people hate it, some people like it ironically. Today I'll be analyzing exactly what is so bad about Sonic.exe. Get your hyper-realistic blood ready. This is Sonic.exe. The basic plot of Sonic.exe is pretty much the plot of almost all video game creepypastas. A ripoff of Ben Drowned. An actually good creepypasta that I will absolutely make more comparisons to in this review. Basically, some average teenager gets some kind of mod or hack or bootleg or version of a popular game, and freaky things happen when they play it. In this case, a teenager named Tom gets a strange game disc from his friend Kyle. This event here is a huge problem with this pasta. Kyle sends a letter along with the list that has a bunch of incoherent rambling that basically just boil down to this. Destroy the disc. Do not play the game. And yet Tom does it anyway. Let's just analyze this, shall we? The only context Tom ever receives is this letter, from his best friend, mind you, begging him to not play the game. There's really no other way to interpret this. Even if the game won't kill him, Kyle doesn't want Tom to play the game. If he wanted Tom to play the game, he would have said so. There's no point in trying to use reverse psychology or anything because there is no context. But then Tom sees Sonic on the disc, and all of that gets thrown out the window. This makes Tom both a horrible friend and a total idiot. Even more so when the thought of destroying the disc never once crosses his mind at any other point. It's revealed that the disc is haunted by a demon or monsters of some kind that looks like Sonic. The actual things that happen in the game are pretty weak when it comes to horror. It's pretty much just gore, and not even creative gore. It's just blood and not a whole lot more. And it wouldn't be a bad creepypasta without something being hyper-realistic. Let me just explain what hyper-realistic actually means. Hyper-realism is an art genre that aims to make paintings and sculpture as realistic as possible. That does not really apply to an image that's on a screen that looks real. The correct term for that would be photorealistic. But then again, that's not common knowledge. Anyway, let's just compare what happens in Ben Drowned to what happens in Sonic.exe. In Ben Drowned, the game looks a lot like Majora's Mask, only things become weird in small ways. Textures are off, music sounds wrong, words become unreadable. The point is that for the most part it was subtle. There was actually given time for an atmosphere to develop. In Sonic.exe, we get mutilated animals, lots of blood, and even more blood right off the bat. The author rushes into the gore too fast for the audience to really be affected by it. And when the actual gore starts, it exposes another huge problem with the writing. The very biggest problem with JC the Hyena's writing style is the element of repetition. When I say repetition, I mean it in two different ways. Two different ways that drastically take away from the style. The first is the repetition of descriptions. I know that Sonic.exe has black and red eyes that cry blood, and there is probably no force on earth that can make me forget that because it is stated about a dozen times over the course of this story. The thing about descriptions is that you only really need to be told them once. It's not like the eyes might change color at any given time, and the reader needs to be assured they are still, indeed, red and black. Repeating a description of something can be used to add emphasis, but it has to be done sparingly, and that is not the case here. There's also the constant blood. It just stops becoming shocking and just starts being mundane with the repetition. JC the Hyena wrote this story the same way that the people behind the time machine I found at a yard sale make a movie. They don't think that the audience will assume anything and have to be told things over and over, or make sure that they see everything. And that's not how you're supposed to treat your audience. Repetition cannot add to the atmosphere. it can only drain it. Excessive repetition cannot enhance descriptions, it weakens them. Both of these are due to jamais vu, basically the idea that things lose meaning each time they're repeated. For example, if you hear the word fun over and over, it eventually stops sounding like a word. There's also repetition on the actual part of the story. Sonic.exe is pretty much the same sequence of events repeated 3 times. The character is in a spooky location that gives plenty of blood, they're chased by Sonic.exe, and then they end up in some sort of torture state. That sequence of events is so shamelessly repeated makes the story both incredibly boring and incredibly predictable. 2 things that you absolutely do not want your horror story to be. Even an actually scary event will become less so if you repeat it, so it absolutely destroys the whole creepy part of the pasta. At most, repetition can convey the passage of time, and at worst, it just fills up space. This leads to the final result being both too long and not very eventful. If JC the Hyena had cleared up the repetition, this pasta would have been about 1,000 words shorter, and everybody involved would be a lot better off. This pasta has a lot of errors, and they're definitely the most fun part about it. There are plenty of them that involve things like spelling, grammar, or just logic in general. You know that you're in for a treat when there is literally a grammar error in the very first sentence. I'm a total Sonic the Hedgehog fan, much like everybody else. I believe that there was supposed to be a comma there. I could just nitpick everything, but I'll condense it to a highlight reel. By the way, these errors are taken in context and as they were originally written in the published version. First off, there are all sorts of little tense swaps. It really just seems like JC couldn't decide whether to have the story in past tense or present tense, so he just sort of decided on both. It absolutely does not work that way. When telling a narrative, you have to keep it in one tense, for reasons that I hope are obvious. I heard a creepy pixelated laugh. Pixels are for images. Saying that a sound is pixelated is like saying that a sound is orange. I kept tails to continue. I don't even have to explain that one. Okay, not only does this sentence here use a semicolon incorrectly, there is no transition linking the 2 parts of this sentence together. It wasn't until I saw why that sentence is a cliffhanger with no resolution. I wasn't even moving my keyboard to make him move. Of course you weren't. You press keys to move the character. Or was he really just moving the keyboard around yelling, "Why is nothing happening?" I had a growing feel of dread. Once again, that sentence speaks for itself. Did Sonic pop in front of red static too? Did I miss that part? Let's see, 15 is definitely more than 1, so you should have said 15 seconds. And then we got this very, very long run-on sentence. You need to use commas, dude. Alright, here, he's either trying to abbreviate they were as there, or he just swapped the tenses again. Either way, it's an error. However, the most common error in the pasta is missing transitions in a sentence. I lost count of the number of times that I saw a sentence that could use a comma, or words like as, that, and, etc. I understand that some things can end up being overlooked when proofread, but if a story has this many errors, it becomes very obvious that it was not proofread once, and it shows utter carelessness on the part of the writer. If the actual person who wrote the story can't even be bothered to read over it one time, why should I? The worst part of this pasta is the ending. Once the 3rd character gets attacked, the story becomes an absolute chore to get through. It was melodramatic from the start. The narrator overreacts so much he seems unstable, but this ending just takes that to a whole new level. An image appears on the screen, and the way it is described makes it seem like the most horrifying thing ever created by anybody. However, thanks to the story's fan base, this exact image has been replicated. Here it is. Are you having a seizure yet? No? Congratulations, you're sane! Then, from this picture alone, Tom draws the conclusion that Sonic.exe is a horrifying, monstrous demon who tortures souls in its own dimension for all of eternity. All of that from a scary picture and I am God. This is definitely jumping to conclusions, and he's just lucky that the story is stupid enough for that conclusion to be correct. And then he cries over 3 fictional characters that are apparently in some sort of pain, like actually physically crying. I'm not going to act like there aren't video games out there that can produce tears, but Sonic.exe is not one of them. Then, one of the worst endings to any horror story ever. The final scare is this. Sitting on my bed, staring right at me, was a Sonic plushie with bloodstains under its eyes. Okay. Let me just tell you what's wrong with this, just in case you didn't know. The first problem is the diction. It wasn't a stuffed Sonic. It wasn't a Sonic toy. It wasn't even a Sonic doll. It was a Sonic plushie. JC the Hyena is trying to scare us with a sentence that contains the word plushie. Secondly, why couldn't Sonic.exe himself have been behind him? And lastly, what did the Sonic.exe doll do? Stare at him? This is an atrocious ending stinger. Alright, all things considered, is Sonic.exe really that bad? Yes and no. It is absolutely true that the story is melodramatic, poorly written, repetitious, and not scary in the slightest. And it's also true that this pasta did not at all deserve the attention that it got. But there is still plenty of worse creepypastas out there than Sonic.exe. Also, the errors and overall campiness of the story give it a sort of readability. Is it good? Absolutely not, but it can be entertaining if you go into it with the right mindset. And, if nothing else, at least it isn't the sequel. See you on Halloween night.